By the late 1520s, Henry VIII had a problem that was becoming impossible to ignore. He had been married to Catherine of Aragon for nearly 20 years. The marriage had produced a daughter, the future Mary I. But Henry still lacked the one thing that he believed England desperately needed: a male heir. For a medieval king, this was not simply a personal disappointment. The memory of civil wars was still fresh, and Henry feared that without a clear successor, the kingdom could once again descend into chaos after his death. At the same time, another factor was beginning to influence his thinking. Henry had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn. What began as a royal desire soon evolved into one of the greatest political and religious crises in English history. Henry did not initially seek to create a new church. His first objective was much simpler. He wanted the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine so that he could marry Anne. In Henry's view, there were arguments that justified the request. Catherine had been previously married to his older brother, and Henry increasingly convinced himself that the marriage had never been valid in the eyes of God. If the Pope agreed, the problem would be solved. The trouble was, the Pope found himself trapped between theology and politics. Catherine was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe at the time. Granting Henry's request would have created enormous political complications, and after years of negotiations, delays and diplomatic manoeuvring, it became clear that the annulment was unlikely to happen. Henry expected an approval. Instead, he encountered resistance, and Henry VIII was not a man who responded well when somebody told him no. As the dispute dragged on, Henry and his advisors began exploring a far more radical solution. If the Pope would not approve the annulment, perhaps England no longer needed the Pope's approval at all. Over several years, Parliament passed a series of measures that steadily reduced papal authority in England. The process reached its climax with the Act of Supremacy passed in 1534, which recognised Henry VIII as supreme head of the Church in England. The consequences stretched far beyond Henry's marriage. Monasteries would eventually be dissolved, church wealth would be redistributed, and religious life across the kingdom would be transformed, and England would embark upon a religious journey that would shape its history for centuries. The irony was that none of this had been Henry VIII's original goal. He started by seeking permission. He ended by rejecting the authority of the institution which he had sought it. Popular history often reduces this story to a simple punchline. Henry VIII created a church because he wanted a divorce. There is some truth in that statement, but the reality is far more significant. The king's desire to end his marriage was certainly the spark that ignited the crisis. Yet the fire spread quickly into questions of religion, law, and political power. What began as a dispute over one royal marriage evolved into the English Reformation, permanently changing the relationship between church and state. Henry VIII eventually married Anne Boleyn, though that marriage ended as notoriously as it began. In time, he would have 6 wives, while England would continue to wrestle with the religious consequences of his decisions long after he was gone. Few people set out to reshape an entire nation's religious identity. The fact that his quest ended with the creation of the Church of England is what makes this story one of the most extraordinary in British history.